Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is Philosophossum, and this is going to be part 3 in a series of videos where I respond to comments made by a guy named Donald Hariot. A link to our conversations can be found in the description. In the last video I discussed his views regarding natural rights. More specifically, I addressed why a lot of the arguments he made contradicts his claim that he believes in natural rights. In this video, I'm going to explore the idea of natural rights in more detail. Specifically, I'm going to discuss the non-aggression principle, where it comes from, and address Donald's arguments against the non-aggression principle. Let's get into it. So of course, as I discussed in this last video, Donald does claim to believe in natural rights. However, he doesn't believe that they're ironclad and easily discoverable. Well, you see, the problem with that, as I've discussed in my last video, if you make the claim that rights are natural or that morality is objective, you're arguing that rights and morality are fundamental parts of reality. This is an attempt to make an objective claim about reality that can be proven. And anytime you try to do this, try to make an objective claim about reality, you have to make sure it is as ironclad as you possibly can. You essentially have to use something that has the rigor of science. Looking through a lot of Donald's arguments, they appear to be made on a very emotional basis. And if he was arguing from an emotivist or utilitarian or subjectivist point of view, then this may hold some water. But remember, he's arguing for objective morality. That morality is an inherent and provable property of the universe. And if he wants us to take his idea seriously in this regard, he's going to need more than just emotions. You see, Donald sits there on his logically programmed computer in his technologically protected country with mathematically engineered roads, drinking scientifically purified water, with a power grid designed upon concepts like voltage, current, resistance, impedance, inductance, etc. When it comes to getting results in life, what you need is the rigor of logic, science, mathematics. These are the things that give us objective truth, not emotions. So basically, in order to make the claim that morality is objective or that it's a discoverable aspect of our universe, you need some epistemological process that has the rigor of logic behind it. Now, of course, according to Donald, the best way to discover what our natural rights are is through democracy. In my last video, I sort of explained what the problem with this is. Democracy is not a measure of truth, it's a measure of popularity. An idea gets more votes based on how much people like it, not necessarily how much more true it is. It lacks the rigor of objective logic. Furthermore, because of something called the Euthyphro dilemma, which I go in more detail in the last video, any sort of decision-making process used by the majority or by people trying to influence the majority would necessarily imply that there's some logic or thought process independent of the democratic process that determines what rights are. So, as in the Euthyphro dilemma, bringing in the opinion of the gods has no bearing on the issue of piety. Bringing in the opinion of the majority has no bearing on the issue of natural rights. Another reason that Donald's views are problematic from a purely scientific and logical perspective is that he believes that there should be a singular centralized entity that has the final authority on what our rights are. The reason he believes this is because supposedly, if individuals were free to determine what their rights were for themselves, that would result in, to use his own words, a total shit show. This of course flies in the face of a major concept in science, known as independent verifiability. You see, when you make an objective truth claim about reality, according to science, that should be objectively verifiable by any independent group or institution. So if you make the claim that, for example, the sine and cosine of 45 degrees is equal, and provide me with your reasoning for believing such, I should be able to follow through your reasoning and arrive at the same conclusion, if it really is objectively true. So the fact that he's not confident that his moral principles should be objectively verifiable, and that we need some centralized authority with a final say on it, tells me that he doesn't truly believe that these are views born out of any sort of logic or reasoning, but rather emotions. So if not through democracy or a monopolistic final authority, how do we decide what our natural rights are? Well, when making a natural judgment about the world, you want to make sure, again, you're using the rigor of logic and science. And whenever you're using a scientific or logical process, the very first thing you always have to do, the absolute first step, is to suspend your biases. Now here's what I mean by that. When one is engaging in the scientific process, what they're essentially trying to do is seek out truth about the world. Now when they're doing this, they may very well have their own preconceived idea in their mind of what that may be. But remember, your goal is to seek out the truth as it is, not as you believe it to be. So because everybody has these preconceived notions of what the truth may be, and because it's so easy to let these preconceived notions drive your thinking, bias is such a natural part of the human mind, it's important that when going into a scientific process that you beforehand sort of make an effort to suspend these preconceived notions that you have. And that's basically what scientists do whenever they go into an experiment. The first thing they do is they put to the side their preconceived notions of what they think might be, so they can just look at the evidence of the experiment as it comes to them. This is sort of what René Descartes talks about in his book Meditations on First Philosophy, suspending everything that you believe so you can look at the truth as it is, basically. Now, since this is the very first and arguably most important step in any scientific process, you'd think that Donald would have made this a priority, but Donald is just dead convinced that his way of doing things is the best. You know those Chinese finger cuffs where the more you pull your fingers apart, the tighter they get? Well, it would seem that the more someone would press this guy to suspend or reconsider his basic beliefs, the more tightly he'd cling on to them. Like, he was just so dead convinced he was right, he wasn't even willing to consider the possibility that they could be wrong. And this is another reason that I don't believe him when he says he believes in natural rights. How can someone believe in natural rights if they aren't even willing to take the very first step in the process of discovering them? So once you've suspended your bias, the next thing you need to do is start with axioms. What are axioms? Well, they're basic rules of logic that we automatically know to be true. And they're actually some of the most basic concepts in philosophy that go all the way back to Plato and Aristotle. So going back to my previous example with Descartes' Meditations, after Descartes suspended everything that he thought he knew, he proceeded to try and build a framework of knowledge, starting with things he knew he could know for certain. And that's basically what we're doing here. When we put to the side everything that we think we know, we have to start from somewhere, and these axioms are sort of like our starting point. So now that I've been going on about these axioms for so long and how they're fundamental to all of logic, and how they're essentially the foundation upon which we build all of our knowledge and reason, what are these axioms? Well, there's actually several of them, and of course any sort of formal logic course will go into detail on all the axioms, but there's two in particular that are important. The first one is called the Law of Non Contradiction, and it states in very simple terms, a premise and its negation cannot both be true at the same time. What that basically just means is that a statement can both be true and false at the same time. For example, right now, you can't both be sitting in a chair and not sitting in a chair simultaneously. You can be sitting in a chair now, but not sitting in a chair later, but not both at the same time. And that goes for any premise. Now, the flip side of the Law of Non Contradiction is what's known as the Law of Excluded Middle, which states that either a premise or its negation must be true. Basically, what this implies is that a premise is either true or false. There's no third option. So to expand upon the example I used earlier, right now I can assume that you're not both sitting and not sitting in a chair at the same time, because that would be impossible, but also that you are either sitting or not sitting in a chair. Everyone watching this video right now is either sitting or not sitting in a chair. And I know this for a fact. I know this for sure. See, what's cool here is that using these axioms, I made assumptions about every single person watching this video right now. I can't see anybody watching this video right now. I have no clue who is watching this video at any given moment, or know anything about them, and yet I'm still able to make assumptions that I know for sure to be true. That right there is the power of axioms. That's how useful these things are. So with these axioms in your arsenal, you're now ready to move on to the next step, which is to sort of build your logical framework. Your logical framework is going to be kind of like the tools that you use to build your argument. If you want to think of an argument as like a house, the materials that make up the house, like the wood, nails, screws, that's sort of like the premises, that's the substance. In order to combine that substance into something useful, you need tools, and that's sort of where the logic comes in. So the premises would be like your wood, nails, screws, and the logic would be like your hammers, saws, drills, etc. Now, while our axioms are some pretty powerful tools, we can actually expand upon them and create even stronger logical tools. Using our axioms as sort of like a foundation, we can expand upon them and create principles that are even more useful. So let's get into it. So now that we understand what our basic axioms are, we can actually expand upon this and create a general principle. Since we know that a premise and its negation cannot both be true, but also one or the other must be true, we can assume that any argument that violates either of these two rules must be false. Therefore, in order to be true, an argument must be consistent. So next we have the burden of proof. So the burden of proof is basically like the goalpost, like what it is you need to do in order to prove your argument correct. You'll often hear this term used frequently in law. For example, in a criminal case, the burden of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. In a civil case, the burden of proof is a preponderance of the evidence. What these terms mean essentially is what is it that this side has to do in order to prove that its side is correct in the case. Now, because we know that all arguments have to be consistent in order to be true, we can automatically infer that anyone who makes an argument and expects people to believe it is going to have that burden to make sure that it's going to be consistent. That's a necessary condition of truth for an argument. Now, it should be noted that just because an argument might appear to be inconsistent doesn't necessarily mean it is inconsistent or wrong. To use a common example used in many logic courses, a barber shaves everyone who lives in the town who doesn't shave himself. Does that barber shave himself? Well, from the law of excluded middle, we know that it's either one or the other. He either does or he doesn't. There's no third option. So, assuming that the barber does shave himself, since he shaves every man in town who doesn't shave himself, he'd also have to not shave himself. Now, let's suppose he doesn't shave himself. Well, he'd have to shave himself then, because he shaves every man who doesn't shave himself. So it would appear then that this man would have to both shave and not shave himself, which means it would be a contradiction. So on its surface, it would appear that this argument is inconsistent and therefore wrong. However, remember that the barber shaves every man in a particular town who doesn't shave himself. If the barber lives in a different town from where he shaves people, then it essentially doesn't matter whether or not the barber shaves or doesn't shave himself. Since he lives outside that town, he's outside of that criteria for whom he shaves. So an argument that appears inconsistent may not necessarily be so if the person putting forth that argument can somehow account for that inconsistency. From all of this, we get the Law of Parsimony, also known as Occam's razor. Now, there are different variations on this one, but what they all basically say is that since all arguments have a burden to prove their consistency, as we just demonstrated, an argument that is more consistent is more likely to be true. So going back to the example I used before with the barber analogy, notice how in order for that argument to be true, we had to make additional assumptions. For example, we had to assume that the barber doesn't live in the town where he shaves people, but the scenario presented to us didn't tell us anything at all about where the barber lived. The only thing we know about the barber is that he shaves people who don't shave themselves in that town. So we had to make an assumption in order for the argument to be considered correct. We don't actually know where the barber lives. For all we know, the barber does live in that town and the argument is ultimately false. So by attempting to salvage this argument by adding assumptions to it, we've actually ended up with something a lot weaker than if we were able to go off just what the facts of the situation were. So unless someone can prove for sure where that barber lives, the strongest position thus far is that the argument is false. And finally, we have active versus passive arguments. Basically, the difference between the two is that active arguments take a positive stance on something and passive arguments take a negative stance on something. A very common arena in which you see the dichotomy between the two is in religious arguments. On the one hand, you have theists, Christians, Muslims, Jews, any sort of religion that believes in a god, and you have atheists, people who don't believe in any god whatsoever. Now, the theists are taking the active position. They're positively arguing that God does exist. And the atheist is taking the passive position. He's arguing that no, God does not exist. There is no such thing as God. So because of the law of excluded middle, we know that one of them has to be right, and it's not quite easy to prove whether or not God exists. I mean, this has been an issue that's been debated since the beginning of civilization, arguably, so basically it boils down to which side holds more epistemic muster. Well, as I've just explained, whichever argument relies on the least amount of assumptions is the one most likely to be true. And the thing is, any active or positive stance makes assumptions. When you say, I believe that God exists, what you're saying is that there is something somewhere out there that you can point to and say, God. An atheist really isn't making any assumptions, he's just going off the information that's already there. I look around in the world, I don't see any sort of God. A lot of the scientific phenomena in our world can be explained without one. The atheist is going off information that we have, and the theist is making assumptions. Therefore, the theist has the higher burden of proof. A common move you'll see done in a lot of religious arguments is that the theist will say, well, maybe we can't prove that God exists, but we also can't prove God doesn't exist. Therefore, we have just as much reason to believe that he does and he doesn't. The problem with this is that it puts the burden of proof on the passive position, which would mean that the side that makes more assumptions, that is, that things exist unless they can be proven not to, would be considered the one more likely to be correct. And it's here that we see why it is that putting the burden of proof on the passive side really is a problem. Suppose that there's a nut that cannot possibly be broken, and a nutcracker that is capable of breaking it. Well, both of these things are mutually exclusive. One existing implies the other not existing. But if the burden of proof is on non-existence rather than existence, well then we'd have equal reason to believe that either would exist. So we would have to assume that two things that cannot both exist at the same time would in fact exist at the same time, which would then be a contradiction, as we have well established by now, are automatically false. So whenever you're in an argument, especially a religious one, make sure you take careful notice of which side is active and which side is passive. And be especially wary if the active side tries to flip the burden of proof onto the passive side. So that was probably a lot of information to take in, and you're probably wondering why I'm telling you all this. Well, the non-aggression principle is built upon all these concepts, so you do kind of have to be at least somewhat familiar with them in order to understand the non-aggression principle. I also think it's important to make clear exactly what it is, the sort of process that you need to go through to build your arguments, because not only will it highlight what Donald is doing wrong in his arguments, but it'll help reinforce what I'm doing with mine. And if Donald does happen to stumble upon this video, maybe he'll learn what he's doing wrong. Or at the very least, people watching this will be better able to criticize and evaluate arguments, but I digress. So with this important logical foundation built, next video I plan to go in detail on the non-aggression principle, actually explain what it is, and if there's time left, maybe get into property rights and taxation. Until next time, this has been Philosophossum, making stupidity play dead. Have a good one.